Hi everyone, this is Amy Johnson Crow and want to welcome everyone to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week we are going to be tackling changing names and other challenges, finding the females in your family tree. And finding females is one of those topics. It's sort of a universal challenge. A lot of people have sort of top-heavy family trees. They have a lot on dad's side, maybe not quite so much on mom's side. And it seems to be the females in the family where our lines get stuck and where we get those brick walls. So what we're going to be talking about today is how we can get around some of these challenges and find some good strategies for finding those females in the family tree. So what is it about finding females that makes it so hard? Why is it that we seem to get stuck on that side of the tree? Well, in many cultures, we have the issue of the woman's surname changing every time she gets married. So the name that you see her with in the census may or may not be the name that she was born with. So going back and finding that maiden name, that name that she was born with, that's the challenge, that's the difficulty. Also think about culture as being really just male dominated, because the fewer rights that a person has, chances are the fewer records they're going to appear in. So women didn't have the right to vote in the United States until the early 1900s. So you're not going to find them on voter lists unless it's something, very, very local, where a few localities would allow women to vote before they won the right to vote in federal elections. But so that male domination with women having fewer rights, that means that they're going to appear in fewer records. So that puts us at a disadvantage for finding those females. And then you have the problem of women being listed without their own name. Think about how many records you've seen where a female is referred to as Mrs. John Smith, or John Smith and wife, or, and this one's my favorite, if you've ever done any research in wills and things like that, you will often see the man who is leaving the will, and he will make a bequest, quote, "to my beloved wife." And nowhere in the will does he actually give her first name. You just kind of want to say, what are you thinking? She has a name. Could you please list it, instead of just saying "to my beloved wife"? So those are some of the challenges that we have when we are looking for those female ancestors. We have surnames that are changing every time they get married. We have them appearing in fewer records, and we have the problem of women being listed without their name. So what are some ways that we can get around this? Well, when you have a problem like this, you really need to have a good strategy. Just trying to go hit and miss, let's look at this record here and this record there, having that sort of scattershot approach typically doesn't give you the best chance for success. You really need a good strategy. And a strategy that I like to employ is to first find the records that I would expect to find her in. Find the records for her. I also want to look for the records where I would expect to find her husbands. And I list that as husbands because if she's married more than once, we really do need to look at the records of all of her husbands. So if you have an ancestor like mine, Matilda DeBolt Skinner Crossan Brown McFillin, or as I sometimes refer to her, Elizabeth Taylor, I want to look at records for all of her husbands because any of them could have a clue to my Matilda. And I want to find the records that I would expect to find her children. And I mean all of her children, not just the one that I descend from, not just that one child that I'm really, really interested in. I want to look at records for all of her children. So if we employ this strategy of finding records for her, finding records for her husbands, and finding records for all of her children, we can have much better success in finding that information that we're looking for her. So let's start with the records that we would expect to find her. Well, of course, the first thing that we think of whenever we're looking for someone, what records could exist for their birth? Census records. I'm really big on census records. So we want to take a look at those. Marriage records. And again, this would be for all of her marriages, not just the one that we're particularly interested in. And of course, records related to her death. Now, obviously, this is not a comprehensive list. There are all sorts of other types of records that we can look at. We can look at pension records. We can look at land records. We can look at probate. But these basic records, the vital records and the census records, this is what's going to give you a good foundation. So make sure that you cover these bases first. Look for these records first. And let's take a look and dig into some of these records. Now, birth records. Early birth records, and I'm talking about those from both the 1800s and even into the early 1900s. Early birth records may not list the child's first name. It's not like in today's society where the child has to have a name and you have to have the birth certificate completed before you can bring the baby home from the hospital. Early birth records often do not list the child's first name. So you will see indexes like these from the Texas State Birth Index, where we have, get my cursor to work here. So we have a child Miller, and instead of having a first name, it's actually infant of AB. So we have infant of AB Miller. We don't know the child's first name, but we do have a county and we do have a date. So we have March the 10th, 1908 in this case. So when you're looking for a birth record and you've done that search looking for their name, try doing the search again with just a last name, a date, in this case a year or perhaps a range of years, and a location, especially if you have an idea of what county she might have been born in. So that can lead you into birth records in those cases where the birth record isn't listing her first name. Ideas where you can get that birth date. Think about if you found her tombstone, have you already found an obituary? Do you have something else? Do you have census records that can give you an idea of the year that she was born? So if you're not having a lot of success finding a birth record with the first name, try taking out that first name and just search by last name, date, and location. You might find some records that you wouldn't have otherwise. There's something else that you might want to consider, and those are delayed birth records. These are going to be more of a 20th century invention. So if you have a female that you're stuck on in the 20th century, think about delayed birth records. Now, these are birth records that were filed after what you might consider the normal reporting time. So these are going to be records that were filed perhaps even years after the birth. And they could be for people born before birth records were kept in that area. So let's say that your ancestor was born in 1900. They didn't start keeping birth records till 1905. She could still have a delayed birth record. And you see these filed a lot of times when someone would be entering school, going to work. This is key in finding females, especially if you're looking for someone who would have been working during World War II. When the women headed to the factories as the men headed off to war, Sometimes the women needed to have a birth certificate or some sort of birth record as part of the job application process. Well, if they were born before they kept birth records in that area, sometimes she would go to the courthouse and file the necessary paperwork to get a delayed birth record. So if grandma or great grandma was a Rosie the Riveter and you've been having trouble finding a birth record, check to see if there could be a delayed birth record. Census Records, one of my favorite record groups. Ask yourself this: have you found her in all of the censuses that she should appear in? If you're skipping around, you might be missing some valuable clues. Case in point, Minnie Drake in 1910. She should have been 40 years old, married, and by that time she had one son named Ezra who was age 20, so he may or may not be in the household. And you're thinking, I've already got this information. I really don't need to find her in the 1910 census. It's not going to tell me anything that I don't already know. But if I go to the 1910 census, look who is living in the household with her. Here's Minnie Drake, Mrs. Minnie, of course, with her husband Elijah, son Ezra, a niece Eula, and look who else is in the house. Mark Abernathy, who's listed as father-in-law. This would be the father-in-law of Elijah. Well, if that's Elijah's father-in-law, that means it's Minnie's father. And look who else is in the household. We have Walter Abernathy listed as brother-in-law. So not only do we have Minnie's father, we have Minnie's brother. And we have a maiden name now for Minnie, Abernathy, all from that one census record. Marriage records. Again, can't stress this enough. Think about all of her marriages if she was married more than once. This is an example from my research. Mary Ann Billington was married first to James Wright and second to John Dexter. Now, it's her marriage to James Wright that I was particularly interested in. The John Dexter marriage, not so much interested in that one. But if I look at their marriage record, John W. Dexter and Mrs. Mary Ann Wright, the 20th of February, 1833 in Franklin County, Ohio. And there was a little asterisk by her name. And there was a little note off to the side in the record from John Billington saying, I can inform you that Mary A. Wright is a daughter of mine, and with my consent that Mr. John Dexter applies for license. So if I had skipped researching that marriage of Mary Ann Billington Wright to John Dexter, I would have missed that note from her father stating that she is his daughter. So again, make sure you're looking at all of the marriages. Death records. Obviously, you're going to want to think about a death record or a death certificate, obituaries, and tombstones. All of these can have very, very good information and very, very good clues when we're trying to find those females. Now here's a modern death certificate, one that we're kind of used to looking at. This is one from Arizona, and we have Amanda White. Now, it's important to note here that she is listed as being widowed. Because when we look down, and it does give us good information on the name of the father is listed as James Ransom. The mother is listed as unknown. One thing that you always want to ask yourself when you're looking at a death certificate is who gave the information, because that can make an impact on how accurate the information might be. So we have that Amanda is widowed, and we look at the informant is John White. And he's living at the same address, but we know it's not her husband because she's widowed. Is he a son? Is he a grandson? Is he a nephew? In other words, does he know? Would he have the knowledge of who Amanda's parents were? So that's something to keep in mind. when you're looking at this, when you're looking at death certificates. Also think about obituaries. And I do say that plural because she could have more than one. There could be a death notice plus a fuller obituary later. Think about towns with multiple newspapers. And also related articles. Had she been ill? And you see notices about her being ill before she died. Notices about family members coming in to see her. Things like that. Here's an example from the Fort Wayne Daily Gazette from the 11th of July, 1884, and this is on page 1, that we have this notice about the death of Mrs. Flora Parker, the wife of Christian Parker, funeral from the Berry Street M.E. Church this afternoon at 4 o'clock. So we have her name, we have her husband's name, and we have a date of death and also information about the funeral. And you might be thinking, woohoo, that's really great. And that is a really nice death notice. But if you stop with that, you're going to be missing a lot, because in that very same paper, this was on page 1, that very same paper on page 6 is an entire paragraph where it lists that not only is she the wife of Christian Parker, but that she died at the residence of her father, W.C. Bainbridge. So right there, we have her father's name there in her obituary. So make sure that you're really looking for all of the obituaries, all of the death notices, all of the articles that could be related to her death. So when you're searching in newspapers, one thing that I like to tell people to do is make sure that you go by a range of dates and put it in a few weeks even before she died. That way you can get those articles about she has fallen ill or family is coming in to visit because she's not expected to live. And make sure that you look for some period after her death. You never know when there are follow-up articles, notices of thanks, things like that, that the family has posted later. So look for a few weeks before and a few weeks after. Make sure that you use that range of dates feature when you're searching for newspapers. Tombstones. I don't think I've ever met a cemetery that I didn't like, so I'm a little biased towards tombstones. I wish that this person was my ancestor because I love how it lists right here that Nancy Ann Heaton, daughter of William and Jane McCoy. So it's giving you her parents and her maiden name right there on her tombstone. Let's move quickly to records of her husbands. And again, making it plural. Look for their obituaries. Did you think about his obituary having clues for her? And something else, think about pension records, particularly military pension records. Oops. Sorry about that. Here we go. Obituaries. Here we have an obituary for Clarence Edsel. So this is for the husband, and it mentions that Mr. Edsel was married in June of 1872 to Miss Cordelia M. Crane, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. A. M. Crane of Illinois. So this isn't even her obituary, it's his, but it's listing her and her parents. Wow, what a great find that is. And pension records, again, thinking especially about military pensions. This is an example, just a little snippet from a Civil War pension file, where some of the questions that were asked, state your wife's full name and her maiden name. And he answered Ellie M. Young, maiden name Ellie M. Steele. And then the question, when, where, and by whom were you married? And he answers with the date August 10th, 1879 in Washington County, Ohio. So again, it's his record, but it's giving information about her. Just like we wanted to look at records of all of her husbands, think about all of her children. If you have James and Martha and they had children William, Robert, and Mary, if you're focusing all of your attention on William, think about what records you're missing out on that pertain to Robert and Mary. They could hold the key to finding answers about Martha. Again, all of her children, not just the one you descend from. Case in point, the Feeney family. Now, the Feeneys, by 1910, the Feeneys were living in Covington, Kentucky. Margaret was already widowed, and she had sons John, Charles, and a daughter, Margaret. Now, Margaret died young, never married, and as far as I know, never had children. So it would be pretty easy to just think about skipping records pertaining to the daughter, Margaret. Well, if we skip out on researching Margaret the daughter, we would miss her obituary, which here we have her obituary where she's listed as Marguerite instead of Margaret. But it says that she is the daughter of the late Charles and Margaret Feeney, née Kelly. Née is a word that means born as and refers to a woman's maiden name. So here we have the mother Margaret, which we already knew, but now we have Margaret's maiden name was Kelly. And again, this is from the obituary of the daughter who never married and never had children. So again, make sure that you're looking for all of the children. To recap, to have success in finding those female ancestors, be methodical, have a good plan. Don't skip hither and yon. Be methodical, take it slow. Look for the records where you expect to find her husbands, and her children, all of them. And most importantly, don't give up. There are always different records you can look at, different strategies you can employ. It can be challenging, but sometimes the challenge is the fun part. Be methodical. Make sure that you're looking for all of these records and covering all your bases, and don't give up. You will have success in finding those female ancestors. Coming up next week, next Wednesday, March the 13th, we are going to be dancing the Irish jig with Griffith's valuation. So those of you with Irish ancestry, you will want to tune in and learn about this awesome resource for Irish research. That's Griffith's valuation. Again, next Wednesday, same time as today's video. That's 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Now, today's video, just like all of the other archives.com videos, are archived and they will be put up on YouTube. This one will be online. Later. I will be popping into the chat room momentarily to answer a few questions that you might have for those of you who are watching this live. Also, ways that you can connect with archives.com and keep up with all the wonderful goings on. Make sure that you follow the blog at archives.com/blog, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Again, for those of you who are watching live, I will be popping into the chat room momentarily to answer some questions. And until next week, this is Amy Johnson Crow. Happy